II. The Great War. Until mid-1914, the surface of European diplomatic relations was placid, reflecting successfully negotiated settlements of colonial and other questions. But certain British journalists were charged by their contemporaries that they deliberately set out to poison Anglo-German relations and to create by their scaremongering such a climate of public opinion that war between the two great powers became inevitable. The scaremongers. The Advocacy of War and Rearmament 1896–1914, A.J. Morris, Routledge and Kegan Paul, 1984. Were they paid or pure? Every anti-German diatribe in British newspapers added to German government concern as to whether it was part of a policy instigated or condoned by Downing Street. Further, there were groups in every major European country which could see only in war the possible means to further their interests or to thwart the ambitions of their rivals. This is why the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on the 28th of June in Sarajevo, soon set Europe crackling with fire, a fire which naturally spread through the lines of communications to colonial territories as far away as China. On the 28th of July, Austria declared war on Serbia. Germany sent an ultimatum to Russia threatening hostilities if orders for total mobilization of the Russian army and navy were not countermanded. A telegram dated the 29th of July 1914 from the Tsar Nicholas to the Emperor Wilhelm, proposing that the Austro-Serbian dispute should be referred to the Hague Tribunal, remained unanswered. At the same time Germany sent a message to France asking if she would remain neutral, but France, which had absorbed issue after issue of Russian railroad bonds in addition to other problems, was unequivocal in supporting Russia. Amid mounting tension and frontier violations, Germany declared war on Russia and France. The French Chief of Staff, General Joseph Joffre, was prepared to march into Belgium if the Germans first violated its neutrality which had been guaranteed by Britain, France, Prussia, Austria and Russia. German troops crossed the Belgian frontier, on the 4th of August at 8 a.m., and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. First pledge. Lord Kitchener, who had left London at 11:30 on the morning of the 3rd of August to return to Egypt after leave, was stopped at Dover and put in charge of the War Office. At the first meeting of the War Council he warned his colleagues of a long struggle which would be won not at sea but on land, for which Britain would have to raise an army of millions of men and maintain them in the field for several years. When the defense of Egypt was discussed at the meeting, Winston Churchill suggested that the ideal method of defending Egypt was to attack the Gallipoli Peninsula which, if successful, would give Britain control of the Dardanelles. But this operation was very difficult, and required a large force. He preferred the alternative of a feint at Gallipoli, and a landing at Haifa or some other point on the Syrian coast. In Turkey, the Sultan had taken the title of Caliph al-Islam, or supreme religious leader of Muslims everywhere, and emissaries were dispatched to Arab chiefs with instructions that in the event of Turkey being involved in the European hostilities, they were to declare a jihad, or Muslim holy war. A psychological and physical force which Kitchener of Khartoum, the avenger of General Gordon's death, understood very well. Kitchener planned to draw the sting of the jihad, which could affect British Indian forces and rule in the East, by promoting an Arab revolt to be led by Hussein, who had been allowed by the Turks to assume his hereditary dignity as Sheriff of Mecca and titular ruler of the Hejaz. Kitchener cabled on the 13th of October 1914 to his son, Abdullah, in Mecca, saying that if the Arab nation assisted England in this war, England would guarantee that no internal intervention took place in Arabia, and would give the Arabs every assistance against external aggression. A series of letters passed between Sheriff Hussein and the British government through Sir Henry McMahon, High Commissioner for Egypt, designed to secure Arab support for the British in the Great War. One dated the 24th of October 1915 committed His Majesty's government to the inclusion of Palestine within the boundaries of Arab independence after the war, but excluded the area now known as Lebanon. This is clearly recognized in a secret memorandum on British commitments to King Hussein prepared for the inner group at the Peace Conference in 1919. See Appendix. I found a copy in 1964 among the papers of the late Professor William Westerman, who had been advisor on Turkish affairs to the American delegation to the Peace Conference. The second pledge, as the major ally, France's claim to preference in parts of Syria could not be ignored. The British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, told the French ambassador in London, Mr. Paul Cambon, on the 21st of October 1915, of the exchanges of correspondence with Sheriff Hussein, and suggested that the two governments arrive at an understanding with their Russian ally on their future interests in the Ottoman Empire. Mr. Piker was appointed French representative with Sir Mark Sykes, now Secretary of the British War Cabinet, to define the interests of their countries and to go to Russia to include that country's views in their agreement. In the subsequent secret discussions with Foreign Secretary Sazonov, Russia was accorded the occupation of Constantinople, both shores of the Bosporus and some parts of Turkish Armenia. This new offer to Russia of a direct outlet into the Mediterranean is a measure of the great importance attached by Britain and France to continued and wholehearted Russian participation in the war. British policy from the end of the Napoleonic Wars had been directed against Russia's efforts to extend its conquests to the Golden Horn and the Mediterranean, threatening Egypt and the way to India. For this reason, Britain and France had formed an alliance and fought the Crimean War, 1854–56, which ended in the Black Sea being declared neutral. No warships could enter it nor could arsenals be built on its shores. But Russian concern for the capture of Constantinople was more than economic and strategic. It was not unusual for priests to declare that the Russian people had a sacred duty to drive out the infidel Turk and raise the Orthodox cross on the dome of Santa Sofia. In 1877, the Russian armies again moved towards Constantinople with the excuse of avenging cruelties practiced on Christians. Again England frustrated these designs and the aggression ended with the Congress of Berlin, and British occupation of Cyprus. France claimed Lebanon and Syria eastwards to Mosul. Palestine did in fact have inhabitants and shrines of the Greek and Russian Orthodox and Armenian churches, and Russia at first claimed a right to the area as their protector. This was countered by Sykes-Picot and the claim was withdrawn to the extent that Russia, in consultation with the other allies, would only participate in deciding a form of international administration for Palestine. The Sykes-Picot agreement was incompatible with the pledges made to the Arabs. When the Turks gave Hussein details of the agreement after the Russian Revolution, he confined his action to a formal repudiation. Like the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, the tripartite agreement made no mention of concessions to Zionism in the future disposition of Palestine, or even mention of the word Jew. However, it is now known that before the departure of Sykes for Petrograd on the 27th of February 1916 for discussions with Sazonov, he was approached with a plan by Herbert Samuel, who had a seat in the cabinet as president of the local government board and was strongly sympathetic to Herzl's Zionism. Sir Mark Sykes, Secretary of the British War Cabinet, sent to Russia to negotiate the tripartite, Sykes-Picot, agreement for the partition of the Ottoman Empire. Mr. Piker was the French representative in the negotiations. Neither Hussein nor Sir Henry McMahon were made aware of these secret discussions. Among other things, the agreement called for parts of Palestine to be placed under an international administration. The plan put forward by Samuel was in the form of a memorandum which Sykes thought prudent to commit to memory and destroy. Commenting on it, Sykes wrote to Samuel suggesting that if Belgium should assume the administration of Palestine it might be more acceptable to France as an alternative to the international administration which he wanted and the Zionists did not. Of boundaries marked on a map attached to the memorandum he wrote, by excluding Hebron and the east of the Jordan there is less to discuss with the Muslims, as the Mosque of Omar then becomes the only matter of vital importance to discuss with them and further does away with any contact with the Bedouins, who never cross the river except on business. I imagined that the principal object of Zionism is the realization of the ideal of an existing center of nationality rather than boundaries or extent of territory. The moment I return I will let you know how things stand at Petrograd. However, in conversations both with Sykes and the French ambassador, Sazonov was careful not to commit himself as to the extent of the Russian interest in Palestine, but made it clear that Russia would have to insist that not only the holy places, but all towns and localities in which there were religious establishments belonging to the Orthodox Church, should be placed under international administration, with a guarantee for free access to the Mediterranean. Tsarist Russia would not agree to a Zionist formula for Palestine, but its days were numbered. The third pledge, in 1914, the central office of the Zionist organization and the seat of its directorate, the Zionist Executive, were in Berlin. It already had adherents in most Eastern Jewish communities, including all the countries at war, though its main strength was in Russia and Austria-Hungary. Some important institutions, namely, the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Anglo-Palestine Company and the Jewish National Fund, were incorporated in England. Of the executive, 2 members, Otto Warburg and Arthur Hanke, were German citizens. 3, Yechiel Chlno, Noam Sokolow and Victor Jacobson, were Russians, and 1, Shmeria Levin, had recently exchanged his Russian for Austro-Hungarian nationality. The 25 members of the General Council included 12 from Germany and Austria-Hungary, 7 from Russia. Kem Wiseman and Leopold Kessler from England, and 1 each from Belgium, France, Holland and Romania. Some prominent German Zionists associated themselves with a newly founded organization known as the Committee für den Osten, whose aims were to place at the disposal of the German government the special knowledge of the founders and their relations with the Jews in Eastern Europe and in America, so as to contribute to the overthrow of Tsarist Russia and to secure national autonomy of the Jews. Influential Zionists outside the Central Powers were disturbed by the activities of the KFDO and anxious for the Zionist movement not to be compromised. Wiseman's advice was that the central office be moved from Berlin and that the conduct of Zionist affairs during the war should be entrusted to a provisional executive committee for general Zionist affairs in the United States. At a conference in New York on 30 August 1914, this committee was set up under the chairmanship of Louis D. Brandeis, with the British-born Dr. Richard Gottheil and Jacob de Haas, Rabbi Stephen Wise and Felix Frankfurter, among his principal lieutenants. For Shmeria Levin, the representative of the Zionist executive in the United States, and Dr. Judah Magns, to whom the alliance of England and France with Russia seemed unholy, Russian Tsarism was the enemy against which their force should be pitted. But on 1 October 1914 Gottheil, first president of the Zionist Organization of America, wrote from the Department of Semitic Languages, Columbia University, to Brandeis in Boston enclosing a memorandum on what the organization planned to seek from the belligerents. With respect to the Russian Jews, we have got to be prepared to work under the government of any one of the powers. Shall be glad to have any suggestion from you in regard to this memorandum, and shall be glad to know if it meets with your approval. I recognize that I ought not to have put it out without first consulting you, but the exigencies of the situation demanded immediate action. We ought to be fully prepared to take advantage of any occasion that offers itself. In a speech on 9 November, 4 days after Britain's declaration of war on Turkey, Prime Minister Asquith said that the traditional Eastern policy has been abandoned and the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire had become a war aim. It is the Ottoman government, he declared, and not we who have rung the death knell of Ottoman dominion not only in Europe but in Asia. The statement followed the discussion of the subject at a cabinet meeting earlier that day, at which we know, from Herbert Samuel's memoirs, that Lloyd George, who had been retained as legal counsel by the Zionists some years before, referred to the ultimate destiny of Palestine. In a talk with Samuel after the meeting, Lloyd George assured him that he was very keen to see a Jewish state established in Palestine. On the same day, Samuel developed the Zionist position more fully in a conversation with the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. He spoke of Zionist aspirations for the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish state, and of the importance of its geographical position to the British Empire. Such a state, he said, could not be large enough to defend itself, and it would therefore be essential that it should be by constitution neutral. Gray asked whether Syria as a whole must necessarily go with Palestine, and Samuel replied that this was not only unnecessary but inadvisable, since it would bring in a large and unassimilable Arab population. It would, he said, be a great advantage if the remainder of Syria were annexed by France, as it would be far better for the state to have a European power as a neighbor than the Turk. In January 1915 Samuel produced a Zionist memorandum on Palestine after discussions with Wiseman and Lloyd George. It contained arguments in favor of combining British annexation of Palestine with British support for Zionist aspirations, and ended with objections to any other solution. Samuel circulated it to his colleagues in the cabinet. Lloyd George was already a Zionist partisan. Lord Halton, to whom Wiseman had access, wrote expressing a friendly interest, though privately expressing Zionist sympathies. The Marquis of Crewe presumably did not express any views in the cabinet on the memorandum. Zionism had a strong sentimental attraction for Gray, but his colleagues, including his cousin Edwin Montagu, did not give him much encouragement. Prime Minister Asquith wrote, "I confess that I am not attracted by the proposed addition to our responsibilities, but it is a curious illustration of Dicey's favorite maxim that race is everything to find this almost lyrical outburst proceeding from the well-ordered and methodical brain of H.S., after further conversations with Lloyd George and Gray. Samuel circulated a revised text to the cabinet in the middle of March 1915. It is not known if the memorandum was formally considered by the cabinet, but Asquith wrote in his diary on the 13th of March 1915 of Samuel's dithyrambic memorandum, of which Lloyd George was the only other partisan. Certainly, at this time, Zionist claims and aspirations were secondary to British policy towards Russia and the Arabs. Britain, France and Germany attached considerable importance to the attitudes of Jewry towards them because money and credit were needed for the war. The international banking houses of Lazard Frere, Eugene Meyer, J.N.W. Seligman, Speyer Brothers and M.M. Warburg, were all conducting major operations in the United States, as were the Rothschilds through the New York banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Jacob Schiff, German-born senior partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company and the most influential figure of his day in American Jewish life, wrote in the Menorah Journal of April 1915. It is well known that I am a German sympathizer. England has been contaminated by her alliance with Russia. I am quite convinced that in Germany anti-Semitism is a thing of the past. The Jewish Encyclopedia for 1906 states that Schiff's firm subscribed for and floated the large Japanese war loan in 1904-5, for the Russo-Japanese War, in recognition of which the Mikado conferred on Schiff the Second Order of the Sacred Treasure of Japan. Partners with Schiff were Felix M. Warburg and his brother Paul, who had come to New York in 1902 from Hamburg, and organized the Federal Reserve System. Apart from their goodwill, the votes of America's Jewish community of 3 million were important to the issue of that country's intervention or non-intervention in the war, and the provision of military supplies. The great majority represented the one-third of the Jews of Eastern Europe, including Russia, who had left their homelands and come to America between 1880 and 1914. Many detested Tsarist Russia and wished to see it destroyed. Of these Jews, not more than 12,000 were enrolled members of the Zionist organization. The goodwill of Jewry, and especially America's Jews, was assessed by both sides in the war as being very important. The once poor Eastern European Jews had achieved a dominant position in New York's garment industry and had become a significant political force. In 1914 they sent a Russian-born socialist to the Congress of the United States. They produced dozens of Yiddish periodicals, they patronized numerous Yiddish theaters and music halls, their sons and daughters were filling the metropolitan colleges and universities. From the beginning of the war, the German ambassador in Washington, Count Bernstorff, was provided by the Committee für den Osten, with an advisor on Jewish affairs, Isaac Strauss, and when the head of the Zionist agency in Constantinople appealed, in the winter of 1914, to the German embassy to do what it could to relieve the pressure on the Jews in Palestine, it was reinforced by a similar appeal to Bull from Bernstorff. In November 1914, therefore, the German embassy in Constantinople received instructions to recommend that the Turks sanction the reopening of the Anglo-Palestine Company's Bank, a key Zionist institution. In December the embassy made representations which prevented a projected mass deportation of Jews of Russian nationality. In February 1915 German influence helped to save a number of Jews in Palestine from imprisonment or expulsion, and a dozen or 20 times the Germans intervened with the Turks at the request of the Zionist office in Turkey, thus saving and protecting the Yishuv. The German representations reinforced those of the American ambassador in Turkey, Henry Morgenthau. An award for Morgenthau's heavy financial support for Wilson's presidential campaign. Moreover, both the German consulates in Palestine and the head of the German military mission frequently exerted their influence on behalf of the Jews. German respect for Jewish goodwill enabled the Constantinople Zionist Agency from December 1914 to use the German diplomatic courier service and telegraphic code for communicating with Berlin and Palestine. On 5 June 1915 Victor Jacobson was received at the German Foreign Office by the Under-Secretary of State, von Zimmermann, and regular contact commenced between the Berlin Zionist executive, Warburg, Hanke and Jacobson, and the German Foreign Office. Zionist propagandists in Germany elaborated and publicized the idea that Turkey could become a German satellite and its empire in Asia made wide open to German enterprise. Support for a revival of Jewish life in Palestine would form a bastion of German influence in that part of the world. This was followed by solicitation of the German Foreign Office to notify the German consuls in Palestine of the German government's friendly interest in Zionism. Such a course was favored by von Neurath, later, Foreign Minister, 1932–38, and Protector of Bohemia, 1939–43, when asked by Berlin for his views in October, and in November of 1915, the text for such a document was agreed upon and circulated after the approval of the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg. It was cautiously and vaguely worded so as not to upset Turkish susceptibilities, stating to the Palestine consuls that the German government looked favorably on Jewish activities designed to promote the economic and cultural progress of the Jews in Turkey, and also on the immigration and settlement of Jews from other countries. The Zionists felt that an important advance toward a firm German commitment to their aims had been made, but when the Berlin Zionist executive pressed for a public assurance of sympathy and support, the government told them to wait until the end of the war, when a victorious Germany would demonstrate its goodwill. When Zionist leaders in Germany met Djemal Pasha, by arrangement with the Foreign Office, during his visit to Berlin in the summer of 1917, they were told that the existing Jewish population would be treated fairly but that no further Jewish immigrants would be allowed. Jews could settle anywhere else but not in Palestine. The Turkish government, Djemal Pasha declared, wanted no new nationality problems, nor was it prepared to antagonize the Palestinian Arabs, who formed the majority of the population and were to a man opposed to Zionism. A few weeks after the interview, the Berlin Zionists' pressure was further weakened by the uncovering by Turkish intelligence of a Zionist spy ring working for General Allenby's intelligence section under an Aaron Aronson. It is no wonder that the Germans, tempted as they may have been by its advantages, shrank from committing themselves to a pro-Zionist declaration. It was fortunate for Zionism that the American Jews as a whole showed no enthusiasm for the Allied cause, wrote Stein, political secretary of the Zionist organization from 1920 to 1929. If they had all along been reliable friends, there would have been no need to pay them any special attention. In 1914 the French government had sponsored a visit to the United States by Professor Sylvain Lévy and the Grand Rabbi of France with the object of influencing Jewish opinion in their favor, but without success. A year later, it tried to reply to disturbing reports from its embassy in Washington about the sympathies of American Jews by sending a Jew of Hungarian origin, Professor Victor Basch, to the United States in November 1915. Ostensibly he represented the Ministry of Public Instruction, but his real mission was to influence American Jews through contact with their leaders. Though armed with a message to American Jewry from Prime Minister Bryan, he encountered an insuperable obstacle: the Russian alliance. For Russia there is universal hatred and distrust. We are approached with one thing only: the persecution of the Russian Jews, which we tolerate, a toleration which makes us accomplices. It is certain that any measures in favor of Jewish emancipation would be equivalent to a great battle lost by Germany. Bache had to report to French President Poincaré the failure of his mission. At the same time that Bache had been dispatched to the United States, the French government approved the setting up of a Comité de Propagande Français auprès des Juifs neuters, and Jacques Bigot, the secretary of the Alliance Israelite, accepted a secretaryship of the committee. Bigot suggested to Lucien Wolfe, of the Jewish Conjoint Foreign Committee in London, that a similar committee be set up there. Wolfe consulted the Foreign Office and was invited by Lord Robert Cecil to provide a full statement of his views. In December 1915 Wolfe submitted a memorandum in which he analyzed the characteristics of the Jewish population of the United States and reached the conclusion that the situation, though unsatisfactory, is far from unpromising. Though disclaiming Zionism, he wrote that in America, the Zionist organizations have lately captured Jewish opinion. If a statement of sympathy with their aspirations were made, I am confident they would sweep the whole of American Jewry into enthusiastic allegiance to their cause. Early in 1916 a further memorandum was submitted to the British Foreign Office as a formal communication from the Jewish Conjoint Foreign Committee. This stated that the London, Conjoint, and Paris committees formed to influence Jewish opinion in neutral countries in a sense favorable to the Allies, had agreed to make representations to their respective governments. First, the Russian government should be urged to ease the position of their Jews by immediate concessions for national cultural autonomy. Secondly, in view of the great organized strength of the Zionists in the United States, in fact out of the 3 million Jews in the U.S. less than 12,000 had enrolled as Zionists in 1913, the Allied powers should give assurances to the Jews of facilities in Palestine for immigration and colonization, liberal local self-government for Jewish colonists, the establishment of a Jewish university, and for the recognition of Hebrew as one of the vernaculars of the land, in the event of their victory. On the 9th of March 1916 the Zionists were informed by the Foreign Office that your suggested formula is receiving, Sir Edward Grey's, careful and sympathetic attention, but it is necessary for His Majesty's government to consult their allies on the subject. A confidential memorandum was accordingly addressed to the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs in Petrograd, to ascertain his views, though its paternity, seeing that Asquith was still Prime Minister, remained to be discovered. No direct reply was received, but in a note addressed to the British and French ambassadors 4 days later, Sazonov obliquely assented, subject to guarantees for the Orthodox Church and its establishments, to raise no objection to the settlement of Jewish colonists in Palestine. Nothing came of these proposals. On the 4th of July the Foreign Office informed the Conjoint Committee that an official announcement of support was inopportune. They must be considered alongside the Sykes-Picot Agreement being negotiated at this time, and the virtual completion of the Hussein McMahon correspondence by the 10th of March 1916, with the hope that an Arab revolt and other measures would bring victory near. But 1916 was a disastrous year for the Allies. In The Story of the War wrote Lloyd George, the end of 1916 found the fortunes of the Allies at their lowest ebb. In the offensives on the Western Front we had lost 3 men for every 2 of the Germans we had put out of action. Over 300,000 British troops were being immobilized for lack of initiative or equipment or both by the Turks in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and for the same reason nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were for all purposes interned in the malarial plains around Salonika. The voluntary system of enlistment was abolished, and a mass conscript army of continental pattern was adopted, something which had never before occurred in British history. Russian nationals resident in the United Kingdom, nearly all of them Jews, not having become British subjects, some 25,000 of military age, still escaped military service. This prompted J. Botansky and Weizmann to urge the formation of a special brigade for Russian Jews, but the idea not favorably received by the government, and the Zionists joined non-Zionists in an effort to persuade Russian Jews of military age to volunteer as individuals for service in the British Army. The response was negligible, and in July 1917 the Military Service, Conventions with Allies, Act was given royal assent. Men of military age were invited to serve in the British Army or risk deportation to Russia. However, the Russian Revolution prevented its unhindered application. German submarine activity in the Atlantic was formidable. Nearly 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping had been sunk in 1916 alone. As for paying for the war, the Allies at first had used the huge American debts in Europe to pay for war supplies, but by 1916 the resources of J.P. Morgan and Company, the Allies' financial and purchasing agents in the United States, were said to be nearly exhausted by increased Allied demands for American credit. There was rebellion in Ireland. Lord Robert Cecil stated to the British cabinet, "France is within measurable distance of exhaustion. The political outlook of Italy is menacing. Her finance is tottering. In Russia, there is great discouragement. She has long been on the verge of revolution. Even her manpower seems coming near its limits." Secretary of State Kitchener was gone, drowned when the cruiser Hampshire sank on the 5th of June 1916 off the Orkneys when he was on his way to Archangel and Petrograd to nip the revolution in the bud. He had a better knowledge of the Middle East than anyone else in the cabinet. The circumstances suggest espionage and treachery. Walter Page, the U.S. ambassador in London, entered in his diary, "There was a hope and feeling that he, Lord Kitchener, might not come back as I make out." There was a stalemate on all fronts. In Britain, France and Germany, hardly a family numbered all its sons among the living. But the British public, and the French, and the German, were not allowed to know the numbers of the dead and wounded. By restricting war correspondence, the American people were not allowed to know the truth either. The figures that are known are a recital of horrors. 500,000 Frenchmen were lost in the first 4 months of war, 1 million lost by the end of 1915, and 5 million by 1918. Who can imagine that the Allies lost 600,000 men in one battle, the Somme, and the British more officers in the first few months than all wars of the previous 100 years put together? At Stalingrad, in the Second World War, the Wehrmacht had 230,000 men in the field. The German losses at Verdun alone were 325,000 killed or wounded. By this time a soldier in one of the better divisions could count on a maximum of 3 months' service without being killed or wounded, and the life expectancy for an officer at the front was down to 5 months in an ordinary regiment and 6 weeks in a crack one. In these circumstances, a European tradition of negotiated peace in scores of wars might have led to peace at the end of 1916 or early 1917. Into this gloomy winter of 1916 walked a new figure. He was James Malcolm, an Oxford-educated Armenian who, at the beginning of 1916, with the sanction of the British and Russian governments, had been appointed by the Armenian Patriarch a member of the Armenian national delegation to take charge of Armenian interests during and after the war. Born in Persia, where his family had settled before Elizabethan days, he was sent to school in England in 1881, being placed in the care of a friend and agent of his family, Sir Albert Abdullah Sassoon. Early in 1915, he founded the Russia Society in London among the British public as a means of improving relations between the two countries. Unlike the Zionists, he had no animus towards Tsarist Russia. In this official capacity, and as advisor to the British government on Eastern affairs, he had frequent contacts with the Cabinet Office, the Foreign Office, the War Office and the French and other Allied embassies in London, and made visits to Paris for consultations with his colleagues and leading French officials. He was passionately devoted to an Allied victory which he hoped would guarantee the national freedom of the Armenians then under Turkish and Russian rule. Sir Mark Sykes, with whom he was on terms of family friendship, told him that the cabinet was looking anxiously for United States intervention in the war on the side of the Allies, but when asked what progress was being made in that direction, Sykes shook his head glumly. "Precious little," he replied. James Malcolm now suggested to Mark Sykes that the reason why previous overtures to American Jewry to support the Allies had received no attention was because the approach had been made to the wrong people. It was to the Zionist Jews that the British and French governments should address their parleys. "You are going the wrong way about it," said Mr. Malcolm. "You can win the sympathy of certain politically minded Jews everywhere, and especially in the United States, in one way only, and that is, by offering to try and secure Palestine for them." What really weighed most heavily now with Sykes were the terms of the secret Sykes-Picot agreement. He told Malcolm that to offer to secure Palestine for the Jews was impossible. Malcolm insisted that there was no other way and urged a cabinet discussion. A day or two later, Sykes told him that the matter had been mentioned to Lord Milner, who had asked for further information. Malcolm pointed out the influence of Judge Brandeis of the American Supreme Court, and his strong Zionist sympathies. In the United States, the president's advisor, Louis D. Brandeis, a leading advocate of Zionism, had been inducted as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court on the 5th of June 1916. That Wilson was vulnerable was evident, in that as early as 1911, he had made known his profound interest in the Zionist idea and in Jewry. Malcolm described Wilson as being attached to Brandeis by ties of peculiar hardness, a cryptic reference to the story that Wilson had been blackmailed for $40,000 for some hot love letters he had written to his neighbor's wife when he was president of Princeton. He did not have the money, and the go-between, Samuel Untermeyer, of the law firm of Guggenheim, Untermeyer and Marshall, said he would provide it if Wilson would appoint to the next vacancy on the Supreme Court a nominee selected by Mr. Untermeyer. The money was paid, the letters returned, and Brandeis had been the nominee. Wilson had written to the Senate, where opposition to the nominee was strong. "I have known him. I have tested him by seeking his advice upon some of the most difficult and perplexing public questions about which it was necessary for me to form a judgment." When Brandeis had been approved by the Senate, Wilson wrote to Henry Morgenthau, "I never sign any commission with such satisfaction." Relief might have been a more appropriate word. The fact that endorsement of Wilson's nominee by the Senate Judiciary Committee had only been made after hearings of unprecedented length was not important. Brandeis had the president's ear. He was formally concerned with the Department of State. This was the significant development, said Malcolm, which compelled a new approach to the Zionists by offering them the key to Palestine. The British ambassador to the United States, Sir Cecil Spring Rice, had written from Washington in January 1914 that a deputation came down from New York and in 2 days fixed the two houses so that the president had to renounce the idea of making a new treaty with Russia. In November 1914 he had written to the British Foreign Secretary of the German Jewish bankers who were extending credits to the German government and were getting hold of the principal New York papers, thereby bringing them over as much as they dared to the German side and toiling in a solid phalanx to compass our destruction. This anti-Russian sentiment was part of a deep concern for the well-being of Russian and Polish Jews. Brandeis wrote to his brother from Washington on the 8th of December 1914, "You cannot possibly conceive the horrible sufferings of the Jews in Poland and adjacent countries. These changes of control from German to Russian and Polish anti-Semitism are bringing miseries as great as the Jews ever suffered in all their exiles." A reference to the 1914 invasion of Austria and East Prussia by the Russians with such vigor that many people believed that the Russian steamroller would soon reach Berlin and end the war. Only the diversion of whole army divisions from the western to the eastern front under the command of General von Hindenburg saved Berlin, and in turn saved Paris. There was a direct effort by certain groups to support anti-imperial activities in Russia from the United States, but Brandeis was apparently not implicated. In a speech to the Russian Duma on the 9th of February, 27th of January Gregorian, 1915, Foreign Minister Sazonov denied the calumnious stories which, he said, were circulated by Germany, of accounts of alleged pogroms against the Jews and of wholesale murders of Jews by the Russian armies. If the Jewish population suffered in the war zone, that circumstance unfortunately was inevitably associated with war, and the same conditions applied in equal measure to all people living within the region of military activity. He added to the rebuttal with accounts of hardship in areas of German military action in Poland, Belgium and Serbia. It is noteworthy that the chairman of the non-Zionist American Jewish Committee responded to an appeal by the Brandeis Group that all American Jews should organize to emphasize Zionist aims in Palestine before the great powers in any negotiations during or at the end of the war, by dissociating his community from the suggestion that Jews of other nationalities were to be accorded special status. He said that the very thought of the mass of the Jews of America having a voice in the matter of deciding the welfare of the Jews in the world made him shrink in horror. The new approach to the Zionist movement by Mark Sykes with James Malcolm as preliminary interlocutor took the form of a series of meetings at Cam Wiseman's London house, with the knowledge and approval of the Secretary of the War Cabinet, Sir Maurice Hankey. A program for a new administration of Palestine in accordance with the aspirations of the Zionist movement was issued by the English Political Committee of the Zionist Organization in October 1916, and submitted to the British Foreign Office as a basis for discussion in order to give an official character to the informal house talks. It included the following: first, the Jewish Chartered Company is to have power to exercise the right of preemption over Crown and other lands and to acquire for its own use all or any concessions which may at any time be granted by the suzerain government or governments. Second, the present population, being too small, too poor and too little trained to make rapid progress, requires the introduction of a new and progressive element in the population. But the rights of minority nationalities were to be protected. Other points were: third, recognition of separate Jewish nationality in Palestine, participation of the Palestine Jewish population in local self-government; fifth, Jewish autonomy and purely Jewish affairs; sixth, official recognition and legalization of existing Jewish institutions for colonization in Palestine. This program does not appear to have reached cabinet level at the time it was issued, probably because of Asquith's known lack of sympathy, but as recorded by Samuel Landman, the Zionist organization was given official British facilities for its international correspondence. Lloyd George, an earnest and powerful demagogue, was now prepared to oust Asquith, his chief, by a coup de main. With the death of Kitchener in the summer of 1916, he had passed from munitions to the War Office and he saw the top of the parliamentary tree within his grasp. In this maneuver he was powerfully aided by the newspaper proprietor Northcliffe, who turned all his publications from the Times downwards to depreciate Asquith, and by the newspaper rowing MP, Max Aitken, later Lord Beaverbrook. Northcliffe was small-minded enough to have Lloyd George called to the telephone, in front of friends, to demonstrate the politician's need of the press. With public sympathy well prepared, Lloyd George demanded virtual control of war policy. It was intended that Asquith should refuse. He did. Lloyd George resigned. Asquith also resigned to facilitate the reconstruction of the government. The king then sent for the Conservative leader, Bannerlaw, who, as prearranged, advised him to offer the premiership to Lloyd George. Asquith and Grey were out, Lloyd George and Balfour were in. With Lloyd George as Prime Minister from December 1916, Zionist relations with the British government developed fast. Lloyd George had been legal counsel for the Zionists, and while Minister of Munitions, had had assistance from the Zionist leader Cam Wiseman. The new Foreign Minister, Arthur Balfour, was already known for his Zionist sympathies. The Zionists were undermining the wall between them and their Palestine objective, which they had found impossible to surmount by ordinary political means prior to the war. Herzl's suggestion that they would get Palestine not from the goodwill but from the jealousy of the powers, was being made to come true. The Zionists moved resolutely to exploit the new situation now that the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary were their firm supporters. Landman, in his secret history of the Balfour Declaration, wrote, through General MacDonough, Director of Military Operations, who was won over by Fitzmaurice, formerly dragoman of the British Embassy in Constantinople and a friend of James Malcolm. Dr. Wiseman was able, about this time, to secure from the government the services of half a dozen younger Zionists for active work on behalf of Zionism. At the time, conscription was in force, and only those who were engaged on work of national importance could be released from active service at the front. I remember Dr. Wiseman writing a letter to General MacDonogh and invoking his assistance in obtaining the exemption from active service of Leon Simon, who later rose to high rank in the civil service as Sir Leon Simon, C.B., Harry Sacker, on the editorial staff of the Manchester Guardian, Simon Marks, Yamson Tolkowski and myself. Associated with Israel M. Seif, another of Wiseman's inner circle, in the business which later became Marks & Spencer, Limited. Seif was appointed an economic consultant to the U.S. administration, OPA, in March 1924. As subsequent supporters, with Lord Melchett, of political and economic planning, PEP, they exercised considerable influence on British interwar policy. At Dr. Wiseman's request I was transferred from the War Office, MI9, where I was then working, to the Ministry or Propaganda, which was under Lord Northcliffe, and later to the Zionist Office, where I commenced work about December 1916. Simon Marks actually arrived at the office in khaki, and immediately set about the task of organizing the office which, as will be easily understood, had to maintain constant communications with Zionists in most countries. From that time onwards for several years, Zionism was considered an ally of the British government, and every help and assistance was forthcoming from each government department. Passport or travel difficulties did not exist when a man was recommended by our office. For instance, a certificate signed by me was accepted by the Home Office at that time as evidence that an Ottoman Jew was to be treated as a friendly alien and not as an enemy, which was the case with the Turkish subjects.